Good evening to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers here in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I am delighted to welcome you to the 12th edition in our virtual series, State to State, German-American State Legislator Dialogue. This series brings together elected officials from the state level in Germany and the United States to talk about some of the most pressing issues at the state and local level. And we are delighted to partner with the Aspen Institute in Germany to carry out this series. You're muted.
And we are, as always, that happens. And we are certainly absolutely delighted to cooperate with you for the 12th time now, but not only in this series, but in many other endeavors as well. I'm Stormy Annika Miltner. I'm the director of the Aspen Institute Germany. And both of our institutions have for a long time recognized the importance of the sub-federal discussions and debates to really address our common challenges and to identify how we can further our cooperation, how we can overcome those challenges, how we can identify areas for cooperation. It's one thing to cooperate between Berlin and Washington or Brussels and Washington, but it's a whole other endeavor and a very worthwhile endeavor to also cooperate between the individual states. We find that, Steve and I, extremely important to strengthen our transatlantic partnership and relationship. Today, we are focusing on the topic of citizen engagement and building trust in government. As we all know, trust in government is an essential element of a functioning democracy and also a functioning society. And in both the United States and in Germany and in a lot of other countries around the world, governments face declining trust in political institutions that have been influenced by maybe sometimes real, sometimes only perceived corruption, lack of transparency, ineffective governance, partisan polarization, media, disinformation, misinformation, and really an overall feeling of voter disenfranchisement. And as I said, some of this might be real, some of this might be just perceived and a feeling, but that doesn't make it less important to deal with. Systemic inequalities can also further contribute to widespread mistrust among especially marginalized communities or regions, and economic instability can exacerbate those doubts in the government's ability to adequately address citizens' needs. And if we look over the past, we unfortunately see a continuous decline of trust in our governments. And I think that is true for both the federal and the sub-federal level. So we have a very important topic to discuss today. And I could not imagine three other person who we could discuss this better with than our esteemed speakers of today. And it's a great pleasure welcoming on the German side, Marion Schiefer, CDU, State Parliament of Schleswig-Holstein. Marion, welcome to our discussion today.
Hi to everyone. Thanks for your invitation, Stormy.
Thank you so much, Marion, for being here. And you do have a relationship to the United States and to Canada, right?
Yeah, that's right. Half of my family, my mother's family, emigrated to Canada during the 50s, actually. And we all grew up in which used to be the American sector. So I'm close to the military hospital of Wiesbaden, someone might know it. So I've always felt very closely, and I know a lot of positive anecdotes.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can come back to those anecdotes later on. So thank you so much for joining us. From the United States, we are joined today by State Senator Roger Niello, Republican from California State Senate. Welcome so much to our discussion round, Senator. And you also have a relationship to Germany, right?
That's correct. First of all, I'm honored to have been invited to this, so thank you very much for that. And in my private life, I'm an automobile dealer. Our family has been in the retail automobile business for over 100 years. And we represent every German franchise except for Mercedes. We have Volkswagen, Porsche, and BMW.
The chairman of my board is Eckhard von Kleden. He's the public relations guy for Mercedes, and I will let him know that there is something which he has to remedy after our discussion.
We'd love to have Mercedes too. That would be great.
And also joining us from the US side is Senator Cindy Winckler, Democrat from Iowa State Senate. Senator, you also have a German last name, but this isn't the only connection to Germany.
Well, and that's my husband's family, but my family, my grandfather was born in Des Moines, Iowa, but the rest of his brothers and sisters were born in Germany, and we would always have wonderful Christmas celebrations at no other time, and sing the German Christmas carols. We also have a German American Heritage Center here in Davenport, where I live, as well as active groups of individuals from many sectors of Germany. So I'm so pleased to be a part of this.
Thank you so much. So we are among friends, and with this, I hand over to Steve into your trusted hands to lead us through the discussion of today.
Well, Stormy, thank you so much. And let me also give a warm welcome to our three speakers. You know, it's not every time that we do this that we have guests who have such deep German-American ties to begin with. And so it's really a special opportunity and a special privilege to be able to have this conversation with you, particularly about an important topic that is of concern to politicians and to civil society on both sides of the Atlantic. But before we dive in, I have one housekeeping note, and that is to our viewers. Throughout this event, you can post your questions in the Q&A, and I will try to fold them into the conversation to the best of my ability. If they are directed to one of our guests in particular, please let me know so that I can direct your question accordingly. And a little bit later in the conversation, we'll open it up for questions from the audience where you can raise your hand and I will bring you into the conversation. But we'll do that a little bit later. So Stormy, thank you so much for setting the stage for us and for outlining some of the challenges that are faced when we think about the engagement of civil society. I think it's fair to say that in recent years, we've really seen an erosion of trust in democratic institutions and practices. And this has taken on a particular importance in 2024 because of all of the elections that are taking place worldwide this year. But there are really critical elections in Europe coming up at the beginning of next month, but also in the United States, of course, and all eyes are on the US when they think about the results of our election. So at the core of what we'd like to talk about today is how legislators at the state and at the state level can contribute to building trust in government. And I thought that a good starting point for our conversation would be to ask each of you how concerned you are about the erosion of trust in democratic institutions and practices, and how this manifests itself in your specific electoral district. And I'd perhaps like to start with you, Representative Schiefer, to get a perspective from Germany, and then we can come to this side of the Atlantic.
Thank you so much. Yes, Steve. As a city councillor in my municipality and a member of the state parliament, trust in state and its institutions is very crucial to me. This is the basis of my political work. I'm therefore deeply concerned about the sovereign's decreasing trust in the state. Of course, in a democracy, to my mind, there's always dissatisfaction with politics to some extent, and that's normal to some extent because it's always about the competition of ideas. And so one part of dissatisfaction results from the decision results themselves. But the other part is about procedures. And that's why we always only award political mandates for a limited period of time. And that's a good thing, for example. So the legitimation always has to be renewed after some years. It becomes problematic when dissatisfaction turns into extremist views. Here we have to react as politicians and as society. In my parliamentary group, I'm the spokesperson for justice, for corrections, for victim protection of the Constitution, and extremism. Therefore, this is core part of my daily work. And until last summer, I worked as a judge in a district court, mainly at a juvenile court. And I'm currently on leave as long as I'm an MP. In this respect, I was entrusted to exercise statal power myself. And over the years, I always had to deal with questions of trust. What concerns me is the brutalization of language, because we're tending to lose part of our democratic culture in how we communicate with each other amongst politicians, and being talked at from some people. That's why I want to say that to me it's very important in Schleswig-Holstein. I think we have got a political style I would rather call communicative. We want to have hard fights on the matter, but fairness in dealings, even across party lines, and that's a good democratic culture. We even reached, or as a success for all democratic parties in our parliament, that during the last elections, the right-wing extremist AfD wasn't re-elected into our parliament. So that's a big deal for us, and we have to make it clear that it's about the issue, that's less about the people involved. All of this helps to create satisfaction with politics. Nobody in my state has such a wide reach in political communication and gets through to everyone or to most people as our Prime Minister, Daniel Günther. His approval ratings were determined 1 year ago, 1 year after his re-election, and 69% of those surveyed were satisfied or very satisfied with him. That's a very unusual number, I think. And from this, we know he does a good job, and that may be due to his matter-of-fact manner and his ability to get to the point of things soberly. So this communicative part, for me, is a very good, positive trust-building factor. That's very important. And on the other, there's maybe a second point. When you're dealing with your coalition partner, you know, we've got a different, far more parties in our parliamentary system than in the US. It's proven useful to allow each other successes, to be kind, and people in the country also appreciate it when politicians do not struggle all the time, but respect the opponent. And as far as concrete measures in the state-citizen relationship are concerned, we have a good open data policy. So that's a direct communication from state to the citizen. Interested citizens have a wealth of information available. So that's, I tend to talk a lot when you ask me. So I've always, you know, you get to know me already. I always have a lot of ideas because it's I'm very involved by heart.
Yeah. Well,
to these themes, maybe as an introductory question, maybe my response already leaves you with some further points we might go into deeper later, but then I'll leave it like this.
No, indeed. I mean, Representative Schiefer, I think this was a great way of kicking it off, and you've touched on a number of different topics that I think will resonate with our American speakers as well. But let me just ask you one follow-up question, and you know, you can maybe be a little bit more brief on this one, which is at the ACG, we hosted a webinar yesterday on disinformation and elections. And one of the things that came up was that different groups find themselves in different information ecosystems, you know, in thought bubbles. And you talked about, you know, dissatisfaction with politics, extremist groups, brutalization of language. How concerned are you about these information ecosystems or these information bubbles that tend to fester and are not really part of the general civil society, and where some of this distrust can actually grow?
I want to emphasize that I'm deeply concerned about that too, and I thoroughly agree with your description. To my mind, when someone is content in his everyday life, and he's got a job, and he sees that, for example, in his hometown, the children's soccer fields are renewed, and he thinks, oh, the mayor is doing his job, and he's satisfied. And when tax incomes decrease, and everyone has now the municipalities, and everyone hasn't got any money to spend on maybe sports fields and so on. People might think, oh, they don't do their job, so why are they paid for, these people up there? And then he won't only think about it, but he will tell everyone. So dissatisfaction spreads more easily than satisfaction. That is one point. And during the pandemic, we've watched that during some social media channels, people went on in their bubbles, plus the algorithms of their news channels only let through certain kinds of information. So people were looking for information that would promote their own perception, because these bubbles are not about facts, they're about perception of facts. And that's a deep concern, because I have no, it's very difficult to get through if someone is already so involved in a parallel universe of false information.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think we face some of the same challenges here in the US. So coming to the US, I have to say, Senator Niello and Senator Winckler, I am delighted to have a Republican from California and a Democrat from Iowa sharing the stage together, because it seems to me that the gridlock that we see at the federal level in Washington is sort of one of the issues that's turning a lot of people away from politics, that's making them frustrated with politics. And the fact that it seems to be very divisive and very hard to find common ground at the federal level. At the state level, my hope is that things might be a little bit different, and that it might be easier to work across the aisle a little bit. But before we get to that, I'd be really interested in hearing from each of you how concerned you are about this erosion of trust in democracy, and how you see that playing out in each of your communities. Senator Winckler, if you want to go first, and then we'll come to you, Senator Niello, after that.
So it certainly is something that I am keenly aware of, and so the effort, just a personal effort, would be to try and be as transparent as possible, try and be clear about positions And certainly one of the things that we are seeing is a lot of legislative initiatives to eliminate access to the ballot. And so as we talk about democracy, there's nothing more democratic than everyone having that right to vote and access to the ballot. This year, we did not have a lot of changes in the rules around balloting in our state, but we have had several years where it changes from year to year. We want to encourage people to come and vote, but I'm concerned that we continue to confuse them with the changing of the rules. So that's one piece, the right to vote in elections. The other thing is just what is happening on the national level certainly filters to the state. And there seems to be, a culture of not trusting elected officials. And although I feel comfortable with my district and my communication with my constituents, I still think that's an overarching issue here in Iowa. Transparency is really important. Being in the minority, we certainly have differing opinions on how legislation impacts individuals. My particular district is fairly middle to low income. Certainly, there are some higher income individuals in my district, but I really do think about the underrepresented populations that are very prevalent in my district and in many of the urban centers in Iowa.
Thank you. And Senator Niello, what's the situation like in California, and where are your concerns?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that we in the U.S., our country was founded by a revolution, and it's sort of in our DNA to be a bit skeptical of government. But what is troubling these days is skepticism has become, in many cases, cynicism, and that concerns me very greatly. It's interesting. My colleague from the other state states that she's in a minority as a Democrat. Well, I'm in a minority as a Republican. In fact, a super minority. We represent only about 20% of the legislature. So from my standpoint, it's very important for me to have good relationships with Democrats to get anything done. And unfortunately, because of the intense partisanship we have that goes along with the more cynical approach toward government as opposed to skeptical, collaboration is many times discouraged. And that's an aspect of our politics that troubles me very greatly. And particularly at the national level, we have representatives who are more performative than they are interested in governing. And many times constituents, because of the intense partisanship, almost enjoy the rough and tumble aspect of politics. And to the extent that that dominates perceptions, that's damaging. Now, you talk about what the local level, what's the role of the local level. Tip O'Neill famously said, all politics is local. And frankly, I think the government that governs best is that which is closest to the people. So I think at the local, and I've served at the local level on the County Board of Supervisors as well as the state level, I think that at the local level, we can go a long way toward combating that cynicism. And the one thing that I like to stress, at least for myself, is our intense partisanship leads to an environment of certainty of our positions. And too many of us get into our own philosophic echo chamber, and we only hear what we want to hear. And I think especially for civic leaders, it's very important for us to constantly entertain, maybe we're wrong. And we all have differing views toward things, but it's important to realize that the other point of view has, even if you violently disagree with it, nonetheless, it has the right to exist and needs to be discussed civilly. And I think more at the local level, we can pursue discussions on that basis.
So I'd love to pick up with both of you on this theme a little bit. You know, Senator Niello, you were talking about skepticism becoming cynicism, and it's sort of being understandable that a lot of people are maybe turning away and calling into question what their political leaders are doing. Senator Winckler, you spoke at the beginning about how important transparency is for you. And I'm wondering how we can bring these two things together, right? I mean, if politicians are maybe a little bit more transparent, if they're trying to work across the aisle, as you suggested, Senator Niello, that you need to have good relations with Democrats because you're in, the super minority in the state of California. Are these ways of reinstilling confidence in the voter, in the electorate, by being more transparent, by showing the openness and willingness to work with the other side and develop solutions?
I think that can go a long way, yes. And with regard to the right to vote, by the way, I agree with that completely. But we have, at least in California, we have neglected civics education. It is not as prominent in the K through 12 system as it used to be. And I've worked on initiatives to try to encourage our local school districts to do that. We need the right to vote brings along with it a responsibility also to be informed and engaged. I think part of what we're what I'm concerned about anyway is a lack of understanding of our form of government and what's needed to be an informed and engaged voter. And I think a more robust civics education would help tremendously.
Mm-hmm. Senator Winckler.
So I think that as much as being trying to work across the aisle, one of the comments that I often make is, but you have to be invited to the table in order to work across the aisle. And it is also I'm in the super minority as well in Iowa, and it's about 2/3, 1/3 in regard to the balance of power, as well as our governor is also a Republican. But the way that government is set up is not necessarily how culture has shifted that process. And so having legislation move forward, if there is not a member of the majority party on a particular bill, nothing happens. I would say, unless it's a really good idea and then it gets written as a Republican bill and then it passes, rather than really formalizing the good ideas and giving credit to the people who have them. And so it's an interesting balance. We are a part-time legislature, so we are now adjourned. We meet from January to April, May, but government happens year round. And so now our role moves to informing the public on what was passed. July 1 is the beginning of our fiscal year, and so there will be a lot of opportunity to work within the community in sharing ideas and possibly sharing ways that some of the legislation still needs to be revised and fixed.
Mm-hmm. So maybe a little bit of a segue, but a question to all three of you that's come in from one of our viewers, which is, does free speech help improve or diminish trust in both countries? And are there differences between the US and Germany? I mean, I think part of this goes to, we have freedom of speech in both countries, but that sort of helps facilitate, if you will, these echo chambers and thought bubbles. But it would be interesting to hear from each of you whether you think this is something that helps or hinders trust of the electorate in the work that you're doing at the local level. I don't know who wants to try to take that on first.
Well, let me take it on by sort of reversing the question. I would suggest that the suppression of free speech contributes to the cynicism that I mentioned. And if people believe that their speech is being suppressed or they're being canceled because they said something that's unpopular, that will very much feed to distrust, not just of government, but of everybody else also, will feed the overall cynicism. So looked at that way, I think free speech is absolutely essential in the public square.
I think one of the challenges that I see is certainly free speech is really the opportunity, as I see it, the opportunity for individuals to share their opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Where we seem to clash, I would say, has to do with disinformation and misinformation across platforms, not only from a political party, but also just in the general public. In some cases, it's misunderstanding, but there are some significant attempts to share information that is just absolutely not accurate. And so the free speech issue doesn't seem to me be a huge problem in being suppressed, but good information and factual information is more a concern of mine.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Representative Schiefer, in Germany, what are your thoughts on this, particularly as a judge as well, with that legal background?
Yeah, but it's not only a judicial matter. So in our constitution, the freedom of expression has a great value, and I'm glad that it is like this, because exchanging different views and fighting for the best ideas to get into real to come out in real politics is the best we can have, and this is the fundament. This is the foundation of our democratic culture and democratic system. So the boundary has to be set where criminal the violence of criminal laws takes place. What we now have to note is that we have a lot of politically active people who do so on an honorary basis, like in all our counties and municipalities and so on. And when you look at hate crime, we've got increasing rates of hate crime against politicians via social media and in real life. And this is what hinders the freedom of expression of those involved in politics themselves. To my mind, it's already partially impaired because people don't post or don't utter their full opinions in the way they would mean it, because they think, and they have already experienced it sometimes, that they get threatened in a way that they couldn't stand and tolerate in this intensity for a long time. So we have what is a Diskursverschiebung, we call it. I don't know how to call it. So
the discussion gets sidetracked, right?
Yes. So it's the frontiers of what you usually act out in fighting on a democratic basis has changed over the years in a very negative way, and it's all our responsibility to deal with this, to stay into a good form of communication as a politician. So I'm not answering as a judge now, but I always have to remind to the people who address me to please stay on a fact-based, on a fact-orientated, problem-orientated, and moderating way of talking.
Mm-hmm. Let's switch gears a little bit. Senator Winckler, when you started sharing with us a little bit about the community that you represent, you said it was largely a low and middle income community. The Pew Research Center conducted a survey in July of 2023, and it indicated that some 85% of Americans believe that elected officials don't care what people like them think, and that's sort of part of what has created some of this mistrust in government. Why do you think that number is so high? And what do you think can be done in an effort to sort of make Americans believe that their political leaders are trying to show empathy for the situation that they might be in?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the way in which elected officials communicate and participate in their community, as well as respond. We get a lot of emails more than anything, and it's so very important to respond when those emails come in, but also make yourself available as an elected official for those meetings, to just explain the legislation, as well as how they might be affected by the legislation that's passed.
And Senator Niello, how about you? What do you think accounts for this sort of sense that people don't feel like they're understood by their elected officials?
I think this gets to why the local level of government has a lot to do with addressing this issue. If you survey people and ask them what they think about their own representative, that rating will, I think, universally, if not just very typically, be higher than their rating of the rest of the body that you're surveying.
Mm-hmm.
Trust of Congress is at an all-time low level, but that isn't quite reflected with regard to local bodies. And I think the closer you get to local elected officials, the less distrust you will see. The faith in city councils and boards of supervisors, as an example, I'm sure as a whole is probably the faith and trust is probably significantly greater than it is Congress. So again, that brings it back to the local level. That government which governs best is the government closest to the people. So I think that it reinforces the importance of representation and the role of local government.
And so crossing over crossing over the Atlantic to you, Representative Schiefer, there was another interesting poll that was conducted by the German Civil Service Association, which found that the trust of the average German in the state, in government, has never been as low as it is today. And I'm curious, part of this obviously has to do with what's going on at the federal level, but how much do you think regional politics has to do with this? I mean, you come from a northern, largely rural state. You probably see some of the same cleavages that Senator Winckler was talking about in her electoral district between what's happening in the major cities, but then what's happening in more rural areas with lower and middle income individuals. How much of a factor do you think that plays in this lack of trust?
We've got these kinds of polls over the last years, and it's not getting better at the moment. We hope we've got the big European elections on the beginning of June, so we all hope that the Democratic parties will turn out to get as many votes as possible, because this is what makes our European Union more stable. But it's not only about dissatisfaction then, but really it's about lack of trust. When I talk to people in a face-to-face situation or via email because they want something from me, I often notice that there's often less knowledge about the responsibilities of the different state levels. So it's a bit complicated in Germany. I think due to our constitution, the competences of our federal system basically lie with the federal states and are only granted to the federal government through the constitution. However, state politicians and their respective issues are significantly less the subject of media coverage, for example. Right. So when I talk to people, they often expect solutions from the state parliament and its representatives and our state government, even though concrete solutions are at a different different level. So they expect the state parliament will dictate certain things, but this is not possible because it's prevented by the principle of subsidiarity. So, and the other thing is that when people write and phone and want something from their representative, they often expect that their ideas will be fully implemented if they participate. They also expect that all the problems they face can be solved through politics, but this is not the case. So citizens then want their politicians to fulfill their wishes. And we have become, what I think is a great achievement, more service-orientated and more communicative in explaining our decisions and the reasons why we decide such. But we cannot fulfill these wishes because we have a good functioning representative democratic system. We don't have a direct democracy at large. We have certain participation elements, very important, and we have a very big culture of directly contacting your representative, your politician, on what state level you want to talk to. But people sometimes get confused, and then they don't know where they get through with their themes. And this is a big, yes, this sometimes causes dissatisfaction in my soul with me on my personal level, because I cannot handle this. I have to explain and explain and explain again why it works at this. I would say a final point is commitment. I get more satisfaction and they get more trust in decisions, political decisions, if announcements and resolutions are implemented and promptly. So this is what people want. They don't want to be postponed. This is worse than if they quickly receive a rejection.
Yeah,
So
I mean, they want to see activity.
yes, and they're right.
So I have a number more questions, but I also want to remind our viewers that if they have questions, they can post them in the Q&A or start raising their hands, and we can start to bring you into the conversation. But in the meantime, and I think that this ties in with what all three of you were just saying, with a view to the European elections at the beginning of next month and the US presidential elections in November, there are lots of questions that people have about voter turnout and who might stay away. And one of the big concerns is that young people are not going to be mobilized and are not going to get out to vote. And there was an interesting survey that was conducted by the Bertelsmann Stiftung that said over 50% of young Germans do not have any trust in government. And the Partnership for Public Service in the US said that only some 30% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 34 trust government. These are pretty staggering numbers from the next generation. And I'm curious, in your work in each of your electoral districts, what are you doing to try to engage the next generation and bring them along and make them understand that, as you said, Senator Niello, you have a right to vote, but you also have a responsibility to inform yourself about how you're voting and about these decisions. So what are each of you doing to try to engage the next generation to make them more politically involved? Because I think that that's incredibly important as we think about civic engagement moving forward.
I mentioned before civics education in our K through 12 school system. And I've been involved in initiatives to encourage our local school districts to include civics education and civics engagement throughout the K through 12 spectrum, not just in high school. And an interesting anecdote, some years ago when I was in office previously, my wife went to a doctor and he was complaining. He knew she was married to me and he was complaining about some issue. And she said to him, did you vote? And he said, well, no, I didn't. She said, well, then you don't have a right to complain. And I've always cited that and found it pretty funny. But education, I believe, is the key to that. And that current attitude of people 18 to 30 may be reflective of the possibility that they didn't receive an appropriate education as to how our system was established, what the structure of it is, how it works, what you should expect and not expect from government, and what you need to do to inform yourself and hopefully stimulate people to stay out of philosophic echo chambers.
I think one of the things that I try to do and I need to do more of is just be more visible where they are. One of the things that I think about is for the young voters, they are very active and busy in so many different things, and some of it is just making money to survive and to support themselves and their families, building a career, being active with their children, and they don't necessarily see the direct connection with all of those activities and government. We do a lot. I think about we have programs for senior citizens. not necessarily do we have programs for young families and or young professionals. And so certainly those are areas where we can improve and really look at the policies that we have. One of the things that I think about that we really need to be more actively engaged in is childcare and the high cost of childcare. They identify that the cost of childcare is equivalent to a year's of college tuition. And when you think about families as they are establishing their family, they are very generally establishing their career as well. And they are not necessarily at the top of the career ladder. And so I do think that if we want to support that age group, one of the things would be public-private partnerships and in the cost of childcare. And if we expect everyone to be in the workforce, which in Iowa we do, we lead the nation in the percent of all adults in a family with children under 6 being in the workforce. It is important that we show that we recognize the challenges that they are facing, and we do that with policy.
And Representative Schiefer, I think I saw a story that in Germany, the voting age has been lowered to 16 in the run-up to the upcoming EU parliamentary election. And of course, that has the potential to bring in a whole new generation of voters. How do you see sort of this generational shift and disinterest in the democratic process? Is this a way of jumpstarting that and getting more people interested at a younger age?
Not only to get them more interested, but to make them responsible as well, because everyone who participates and has the right to participate should have the responsibility to make up his mind what he really wants for himself, for everyone, for the future. We hope that not only through school education, but through this participatory element, this is the primary right to vote in such a big election. We have got this on the state level here in Schleswig-Holstein as well, and I think we hope that our youngsters will want to know what people and parties are fighting for, and should discuss what their own interests are, because there's other polls telling us that people have got a big interest in politics and political decisions. They just get informed and inform themselves on a more superficial level. So this is why they might get into bubbles as well. So we have to invest in media literacy to make them competent enough to decide news, to distinguish news from fake news, for example.
And I think that's incredibly important, right? This is one of the things that comes up over and over again. You know, as we think about engagement and we think about building trust, one of our viewers just sent a note saying, you know, what happens if you approach your representative and they refer you to their staff and then you do not get a response to your concern? I think that's certainly something that has happened to people and has sort of maybe increased their distrust of government officials. But how do you handle that in each of your offices? If somebody comes to you and says, I'm worried about this issue, I'm worried about that issue, do you really try to get 100% response rate to each of those questions and queries?
I certainly do. And I spent a good deal of time making sure that the staff that I hired are extremely responsive, and I do have an excellent staff. But if somebody approaches me directly, I will directly engage with them. But if any follow-up is needed, I will ask staff to do that. Sometimes staff is with me, and they're very proactive in participating in that conversation. Sometimes they're not, and then I take on the responsibility to make sure that they're responded to. That is absolutely essential. I come from the retail business. As I said, I'm an automobile dealer, and that's sort of, it was ingrained in me from 25 years of running car dealerships that if I'm not responsive, I'm going to lose that customer. So if I'm not responsive, I'm going to lose that constituent.
Right.
In Iowa, the staff we have is caucus staff when we are not in session. And we have a clerk during session, but that is mainly to help us with the organization of the bills and the committees and the meetings and that kind of thing. And so it's a situation for Iowa representatives and senators that the buck stops with us. And it's really important because I utilize our staff to help in pointing the right direction, but I have no staff. So, you know, there are individuals that will say, can I come to your office? Well, my office is my home. We really, you know, don't have that network of support staff as a state representative or a state senator. So just
but perhaps technology can play a role there and be helpful. And
absolutely,
you know, I'd like to come. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and when we're not in session, you try really hard to go to those emails on a regular basis, but it is it's always a challenge because you come back, you kind of transplant yourself back to your home and connect back into the community activities.
And Representative Schiefer, what's the situation like in Schleswig-Holstein?
Well, I agree with my colleagues from overseas. I think it's very important to answer almost everything because sometimes you get like some of my colleagues and me, we got 150 emails dealing with one certain topic created by a tool from a lot of people in a very complicated process of decision making. So it's maybe not fulfilling everyone's wish of a fast answer, a complex answer, and a very good communication form. So I have to inform and re-inform people because I don't have the result yet. I can tell them. But I think we have better educated people and interested citizens, and that's a great value. And we should worthy this this because that is something we wanted to reach, and we now have reached after decades of good schools and education programs. There, it's not anymore like this that the government and the politicians are here and the citizens are here and one decides and one has to accept. But we always have to back and to werben for
advertise. We have to make the case, right?
Yes, for acceptance. That's the deal. And so these individual things of letters and answers are important. Yes.
You know, we've covered a lot of ground today, and we're really in the process of wrapping up at this point. But I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask one more question, and I have mixed feelings about it because it's a big question and could lend itself to a whole hour-long conversation. But But very briefly, I'd like to come back to this issue of technology. And Senator Winckler, I'm curious about how technology can help you reach out and be responsive. But I'm also really curious, and this ties into the whole generational discussion that we were having before. I'm very curious what role you think digital platforms can play in helping facilitate citizen engagement. On the one hand, I think all of us sort of look at social media as being a challenge because there is a lot of disinformation. It's very easy to create one's own echo chambers on social media and just have one's own viewpoint reinforced over and over again, sometimes not with accurate data and accurate information. But I think with any technology, there's also something positive. And so I'm curious how you see the role of digital platforms in perhaps helping increase citizen engagement in the current age. And I'd love to hear from each of you about that. Senator Winckler, you were sort of nodding as I was speaking, so why don't I go to you first?
Well, I think it's a balance. There are individuals who the digital platform will certainly, using a digital platform, that is their mode of communication. But in Iowa, we have a much older population as well that are actively engaged in the political process, and not necessarily is that the best way to communicate with them. We were just having this discussion the other day, and they want something through the mail. That they can put on their refrigerator is what the comment was. And so it's a balance. It's thinking about who your audiences are and how best to communicate with them. And some of the older population still receive the newspapers and love the fact that it is a physical newspaper where we have all of the digital newspapers as well. So I would say it's more about balance and thinking about the ages that you want to communicate with, the messages you want to share, and then what is the appropriate platform to get that done.
I mean, I think that's right? Different communication methods for different audiences is what comes into play. But if we don't use digital platforms, we're sort of leaving out a whole segment of society, and it's harder to mobilize them and engage them. Senator Niello, what about you in terms of trying to use digital platforms to engage your constituents?
Well, it's become an important part of campaigning. Certainly, my last campaign, I think we expended more resources on electronic and internet and technological approaches as opposed to direct mail and the like, and it was quite effective. And so for communication, it is important. Senator Winckler, I think, raised a very good point. It has to be sort of demographically appropriate. It is true that older folks are not as much hooked up to social media platforms as younger folks. And also there is a different use of social media platforms. As an example, Twitter and Facebook are less used by people under 30 and more used by people, older people that are on the internet. So knowing the demographic is important in terms of communicating. But as time goes by, technology and social media will be very important tools for public officials to communicate with folks. I have to say, though, so far, I do not think that the proliferation of social media platforms has had a positive impact. It's one of the primary sources of misinformation and disinformation. And that gets back to the philosophic echo chamber that I referred to before. People will see something on the internet, it's that old phrase, it's got to be true, I saw it on the internet, and people will spread it around without ever checking its veracity And so that is somewhat troubling. And with the onset of and further development of artificial intelligence, I keep on hearing that echo in my mind from A Space Odyssey 2001. I'm sorry, Dave, I cannot do that. These are very important things to make sure that they're used appropriately and controlled appropriately.
And I think that that ties in very nicely with what Representative Schiefer was talking about earlier when it comes to greater media literacy, right? I think that in terms of some of the takeaways from our conversation, thinking both about civics education in the US, probably in Germany as well, but then also the real need for media literacy, and not just among young people, but across generations. I think that that's important as technologies change. But Representative Schiefer, I wanted to give you the last word, if you will, on this question of sort of digital platforms and how they can be used to try to engage society and some of the opportunities, but undoubtedly some of the concerns that you might share with your colleagues.
Thank you for this opportunity. Yes, in addition to what has been said before, I want to add that we have to keep a watchful eye on platform providers also, who may allow false information to run completely or insufficiently unfiltered. They also bear responsibility for the quality of the information disseminated via their systems. If this is not noticed, politicians must also think about consequences. So we're talking about this in Germany and Europe as well. And the same applies to the future use of AI. Humans must be able to distinguish news from fake news. False from real news. This requires competencies and regulation in equal measures. So that's to this point, and seeing the technology topic you talked about at a larger level, I want to add the open data. We have got in Schleswig-Holstein our transparency portal, and the Whistleblower Protection Act we now have are also elements of digital participation motivating tools. We urgently need it, and I hope people will use it.
Well, on behalf of both Aspen Germany and the American Council on Germany, I would just like to say herzlichen Dank, many, many thanks. This has been just a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground. Obviously, there's always more to talk about when we get started, but I think we were really able to unpack a couple of essential issues. And so I would just like to really thank all three of you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank back, and thank you very much.
It's been a great pleasure to be with you. I hope we will meet again one day. Thank you.
So much also from my side. Thank you.